The restaurant was one of those places people whispered about, where the windows glowed gold from the inside, and the parking lot always held more luxury cars than the average dealership. Yet night after night, a single table by the corner window remained occupied by only one man. He would arrive precisely at 7:15 p.m., wearing a crisp charcoal suit, always the same style, always tailored to perfection. His name was Adrian Vale, 38 years old, owner of a global tech empire and born profoundly deaf. His life was a gallery of polished surfaces, polished marble halls in his mansion, polished chrome in his office buildings, polished smiles from people who pretended to understand him. But the truth was, very few people took the time to learn sign language, and even fewer stayed long enough to matter. Every evening he dined alone, not out of preference but out of habit. Silence was the only companion he trusted. Silence didn't lie, didn't flatter, did abandon. The staff adored him, though he never heard their greetings. He communicated with them through his phone, typing short messages or signing slowly, patiently, even though most of them didn't understand. He tipped generously, never complained, and always left the table exactly as he found it, precise, clean, untouched by anything chaotic. But on this particular night, something disrupted the usual perfection. Adrian noticed it the moment he entered. The soft sound waves vibrating faintly across the floor, not something he could hear, but something he could feel. His perception of vibrations was sharper than most. Years of living in silence had fine-tuned his other senses. The vibrations belonged to the soft cooing of a baby coming from the far corner. He glanced toward the source. A young cleaning lady, still in her uniform, was quietly rocking her infant daughter in her arms while wiping down a table. Her shift had started an hour earlier, but she couldn't find a babysitter, and the manager, after seeing her eyes swollen from crying, reluctantly allowed the baby to stay as long as she kept the child calm. Her name was Marisol, 23, exhausted, underpaid, and barely keeping herself together. Her husband had left 3 months earlier and hadn't sent money since. The baby, little Clara, was 5 months old, with wide, curious eyes and a tiny knitted hat that kept slipping to one side. No one minded the baby, as long as she stayed quiet. Adrian, however, was not no one. He paused mid-stride, taking in the sight. Something about the scene tugged at him unexpectedly. He wasn't accustomed to seeing bobbies here. This restaurant catered to executives and the wealthy. Children didn't fit the aesthetic. Yet there she was, small and warm and alive in a world of glass and steel. He sat down at his usual table, but his focus wasn't on the menu. The baby was looking at him, really looking. Her eyes followed him with a fascination he didn't understand. When the waiter approached to take his order, Adrian raised a hand, signaling for a moment. He typed on his phone. "Who is she?" The waiter glanced over his shoulder and smiled politely. "She's new, cleaning staff, brought her baby tonight. Sorry if it bothers you, Mr. Vale." Adrian shook his head, dismissing the concern. It didn't bother him. He wasn't even sure why. As he waited for his meal, he allowed himself to steal another glance. The baby seemed to notice his gaze and waved her tiny fist in the air. It was clumsy, aimless, yet it felt like the closest thing to a greeting he had received in years. Marisol, noticing the movement, turned around, startled. "I'm so sorry," she whispered instinctively, even though she knew he couldn't hear. She mouthed the words clearly anyway. He responded with a simple nod and a faint, brief smile, the kind that startled people because it was so rare. The night carried on quietly until fate, in its mischievous way, decided to intervene. Just as Adrian lifted his fork for the first bite, the soft, gentle baby who had been watching him with owl-like curiosity suddenly twisted in her mother's arms, reached forward, and with surprising power for her size, threw her pacifier straight at him. It bounced off his sleeve and landed neatly in his lap. The entire restaurant froze. The waiters stopped mid-step, A couple at the bar gasped. Someone stifled a laugh. Marisol's face flushed red. Mortified, she rushed toward him. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she's teething. She throws everything. "Please, please forgive." But Adrian wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the baby. And the baby was signing. Not perfectly, not intentionally, but unmistakably. Her tiny hands opened and closed, palms forward, in the rough, clumsy approximation of the basic ASL sign for hello. Adrian's heart stopped. For a man who hadn't spoken in decades, who hadn't heard a single human voice since infancy, who had long ago accepted that the world would never speak his language. This was impossible. And yet it was happening. Little Clara giggled, her hands repeating the motion with uncoordinated enthusiasm, as if performing the only greeting she instinctively knew how to give. Adrian felt something crack inside him, something old and sealed shut. When he lifted his gaze, his eyes met Marisol's, but she looked confused, unaware of what had just happened. She didn't know sign language. She didn't know what her baby had done. But he did. He set the pacifier on the table gently, stood up, and slowly signed back. "Hello, little one." Clara squealed with delight. Marisol stared at the exchange, bewildered, clutching her daughter closer but unable to look away. Something had shifted in the room, subtle, electric, alive. And Adrian Vale, the man who dined alone because the world was too loud, too insincere, too distant, suddenly found himself drawn into a story he never saw coming. A story that would unravel everything he thought he knew about silence, connection, and family. And it all began with a baby who did the unthinkable. A baby who spoke to him. In his language, Marisol didn't fully understand what she had just witnessed, but she understood enough to know that something about it mattered. The billionaire who barely looked at anyone had stood up because of her daughter. And now he was signing, slow and gentle, as if afraid to frighten the baby. Clara wiggled excitedly in her arms, reaching toward him, tiny fingers fluttering. "I'm so sorry," Marisol said again, her voice trembling from embarrassment and exhaustion. She knew he couldn't hear her, but apologizing felt like the only thing she could do. "She throws things. She's just a baby." Adrian shook his head, raising a hand in a reassuring gesture. It was the first time in years anyone had seen him visibly soften. He typed something quickly on his phone, then turned the screen toward her. "It's okay," she's saying hello. Marisol stared at the words, her eyebrows knitting together, saying hello. He nodded. She looked down at her daughter, puzzled. "You don't know sign language, how did you?" But there was no answer. Bobbies were mysteries. That was nothing new. Still, the sight of Clara mimicking a gesture she had never been taught filled Adrian with a warmth he didn't expect, a warmth he had once assumed he was incapable of feeling. The manager rushed over, panic all over his face. "Mr. Vale, I sincerely apologize," he began, his hands wringing nervously. "She wasn't supposed to bring her baby tonight. She'll step outside, or I can call someone too." Adrian lifted his hand sharply, stopping him. His face hardened, not with anger but with a quiet authority that silenced rooms. He typed, "No one gets punished. No one leaves, the baby stays." The manager froze, unable to argue with a man who practically funded half the city's economy. Marisol blinked rapidly, scared and relieved at once. "Thank you," she whispered. Adrian gestured toward the empty chair at his table. He wasn't sure why he did it. He never invited anyone to sit with him. He barely tolerated people sitting near him. But the baby was still reaching, and something in him felt anchored to her tiny hands. Marisol hesitated. She wasn't supposed to sit. Staff didn't dine with customers, especially not with billionaires. But his gesture was gentle, patient, and unpressured. Slowly she approached. She sat on the very edge of the chair, as if ready to jump away if needed. Clara sat in her lap, staring at Adrian with unabashed fascination. He typed again. "May I hold her?" Marisol inhaled sharply. No one had ever asked her that in months. Everyone kept their distance. People feared inconveniences, feared crying bobbies, feared responsibility. She stuttered, "you want to hold her?" He nodded. But more than want, he needed to. Something old and hollow inside him seemed to reach out before his hands ever did. She looked down at her daughter. Clara was smiling, stretching her tiny arms toward him. "Okay," she whispered, "if she's willing." He reached out slowly. He had never held a baby before, not since his own childhood memories buried somewhere deep. His movements were cautious, reverent. Clara landed in his arms lightly, and he froze, not from fear, but from a rush of emotion so powerful it rooted him in place. She was warm, alive. She reached up and touched his face, pressing her palm to his cheek. Adrian's breath hitched. He hadn't felt a small hand against his face since he was a child. No one touched him gently anymore. People only shook his hand with business-gold fingers or tapped his shoulder when they wanted something. But the baby's touch was pure curiosity, innocent, trusting. He cradled her instinctively, carefully supporting her head. Her eyes sparkled up at him. Then she did it again. Her tiny hands mimicked the sign she'd made earlier, an imperfect, clumsy version of hello. And Adrian. He felt tears gather unexpectedly, stinging. His chest tightened. The room blurred around him. He blinked rapidly, embarrassed, turning his face slightly away. But the baby patted his chin, fussing as if telling him not to hide. Marisol watched the exchange, her heart swelling with confusion and gratitude. She had expected nothing from life for months, only survival. Yet here she was, watching a billionaire fall apart quietly because of the child she'd raised alone. After a long moment, Adrian typed again. She signs, she truly signs. Most infants don't mimic hand language so accurately. She feels vibrations. She responds visually. Has she been tested? Marisol's stomach clenched. Tested, she echoed softly. He nodded. She swallowed hard. No, I can't afford that. The truth sat between them like a shadow. Clara was healthy, bright, responsive. But sometimes, when the blender whirred or cars honked, she didn't react. When Marisol slammed the door by accident, the baby didn't cry. She only startled when she saw movement, not from the sound itself. She had been too afraid to admit what she suspected. That maybe Clara couldn't hear. Adrian saw the realization in her eyes. He typed again, slowly. I think she might be like me, deaf or partially deaf. It is not a weakness, it is not a curse, but she needs support early. I can help. Marisol's breath caught. Help how? He hesitated, as if weighing how much he should say. Then he typed. I own a pediatric research clinic, one of the best in the country. I want to have her tested, for free, no strings. She deserves that chance. The words hit her like a wave, hope so unfamiliar it terrified her. Why, she whispered, why would you do that for a stranger? He didn't type right away. Instead, he looked down at the baby, the tiny girl who was now playing with the sleeve of his suit, tugging with all the strength of a butterfly. Finally, he typed, because she spoke to me. Marisol covered her mouth, tears rising uncontrollably. The rest of the night changed. Staff glanced over discreetly, shocked to see the billionaire smiling softly at a baby, holding her as if she were made of gold. The usual loneliness that wrapped around him like armor had cracked, letting light bleed through. When dinner ended, he returned Clara to her mother, slowly, reluctantly. He typed one final message. Bring her tomorrow, I'll meet you. I promise she will be safe. Marisol nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. Thank you, she whispered with trembling sincerity. As Adrian left the restaurant, Something inside him felt different, lighter, brighter, as if the silence he had lived in for decades now held a new sound. Not a noise, not a voice, but a feeling. A feeling shaped like a baby's tiny hand signing hello. The next morning, the sky was pale and soft, like the day itself didn't want to disturb anything fragile. Marisol stood outside the towering glass building with her daughter in her arms, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. The sign above her read Vale Medical Institute for Children, but she still couldn't believe she had been invited here, by the man who owned everything inside. Clara rested peacefully against her chest, unaware that her entire life might be about to change. Marisol looked down at her uniform, still the faded cleaning dress from the night before. She didn't own nicer clothes, and she'd had no time or money to get new ones. Her hair was tied in a hurried bun. She felt out of place, painfully so, but she whispered to her baby, "It's okay, me Ammer, we're doing this for you." The automatic doors slid open with a whisper, and inside, the bright white corridors hummed with professionalism and quiet efficiency. Nurses greeted her, but she barely heard them over her worry. Then she saw him. Adrian stood near the reception desk, dressed in a simple navy sweater instead of his usual suit. For the first time, he looked almost approachable. Human, his usual solitude was gone. Now he stood tall but softened, as though expecting someone important. When he saw her, he smiled. Not the polite, distant smile he gave strangers, but something warmer. He walked over in calm, even steps. She lifted her hand awkwardly, unsure how to greet him, but he gently touched his wrist to his chest in the deaf greeting. She copied the gesture clumsily, and he nodded with quiet appreciation. Then he looked at Clara. The baby, recognizing him instantly, squealed with delight, reaching her tiny hands toward him. Something inside Adrian dissolved. He gestured to the nurse beside him, typing quickly on his device. "We'll begin with a sensory response test. She won't feel a thing. I'll be with you the whole time." Marisol nodded, clutching Clara close. The tests were gentle. A small vibration pad, lights that glowed soft blue, toys that rattled with faint sound. The doctor observed how Clara responded to movement, touch, vibration, but not noise. At one point, a loud metal tray fell in the hallway. Everyone flinched. Clara didn't even blink. Marisol felt her chest collapse. The doctor finally turned to her, a kind woman with silver hair and soft eyes. "Your daughter is showing signs of significant hearing loss," she said gently. "Possibly profound. We'll need full diagnostics, but she's not hearing the world the same way others do." Marisol's throat tightened. Her legs trembled. She held Clara close, whispering, "It's okay, baby. Mommy's here." But fear swarmed her mind. Fear of the future, of money, of how she would raise a deaf child alone. Tears ran down her cheeks, and she didn't bother to hide them. Adrian stepped closer, touched her arm lightly to draw her attention, and typed, "This is not a tragedy. She is not broken. She is like me. And she will grow strong. I promise you, she will have everything she needs." Marisol covered her face with one hand, crying silently. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I can barely afford food sometimes. How am I supposed to raise a child with special needs?" Adrian's jaw clenched. He typed again, "You won't do it alone." She shook her head. Why would you help us?" Her voice trembled with disbelief. He looked at her for a long moment, then typed, "Because someone once helped me. Because I know the loneliness of silence. Because your daughter spoke to me in the only language I ever understood. And because I don't want to go back to eating alone every night." Her breath caught. She stared at him, stunned. He looked at Clara, who was chewing on her tiny fist, completely content. He signed softly to her. "You're safe." The baby giggled. Over the next hour, they met specialists who explained early learning programs, communication methods, and the possibility of cochlear implants. Though Adrian gently signed choice to remind Marisol that the decision was hers, not the hospital. More than once, she caught him watching Clara with a tenderness she didn't expect from a man who lived in silence, shadows, and steel towers. Eventually, the evaluation ended. Marisol stepped outside with Clara bundled in a blanket, overwhelmed but strangely hopeful. Adrian walked beside her. She looked at him shyly. I don't know how to thank you. You've already done too much. He typed, "There is more I want to do, if you'll allow it." She hesitated. "What do you mean?" He inhaled slowly, then typed something longer. "I would like to sponsor her education, her therapy, her medical care, everything she needs to thrive. And if you're willing, I would like to spend time with her. Not out of pity. Because she brings a sound into my life I didn't know I was missing." Even in silence. Her tears fell again, this time not from fear. She whispered, "You really care about her, don't you?" He nodded. Clara reached for him again, tiny fingers curling toward his. He reached back. Weeks passed. Adrian visited the restaurant frequently, not to dine, but to see Clara. He attended her first therapy sessions. He helped Marisol learn basic ASL. He bought baby books printed with bright hand signs and brought soft toys that vibrated when touched. People whispered, "Who was this deaf billionaire, always seen carrying a tiny baby on his shoulder? Why was he smiling now when he never used to?" Months passed. Clara began responding to sign language faster than anyone expected. Sometimes she would sign Mama. Other times she signed Friend. But her favorite sign, the one she used whenever she saw Adrian, was hello, her messy little hand waving proudly. Adrian cried the first time she signed his name. He didn't hide it. Marisol touched his arm softly, understanding everything he couldn't say aloud. One evening, as the sun set and the world glowed amber, they sat together on a park bench, Marisol, Clara, and Adrian, watching the baby reach for drifting petals. Marisol spoke quietly, "You know, I think she loves you." He typed back, "I love her too. And you. Both of you. If you'll have me in your lives." She stared at him, stunned, her breath shallow. Then slowly, very slowly, she took his hand. Clara clapped her hands, as if celebrating something she didn't fully understand. A family formed there, not in the traditional way, not in the expected way, but in the exact way the universe had intended. A deaf millionaire who had dined alone for years. A young mother who had been abandoned by everyone except her child. And a baby who did the unthinkable. She opened a door between two lonely worlds. Not with words, not with sound, but with her hands. Her tiny, perfect hands that signed hello. And changed everything forever.